My name is Nathaniel Elijah Gray. For 19 years, my foundation funded this school.
You lied to me.
I tried to protect you.
The hallway camera was down. The maintenance camera was not.
No, that's not what it looks like.
Right?
It is exactly what it looks like.
You are blackmailing this school.
Blackmail hides truth. I brought it into the room. A powerful father saving only his own son teaches the wrong lesson.
Then what about me? How much of our life was real?
All of it. And I should have trusted you with more.
Never let shame make you cruel. I laughed when they hurt Daniel.
Westbridge has standards to protect. Then let evidence protect them.
Nathaniel Gray sat in the last row of the school auditorium, wearing a faded work jacket, steel-toed boots, and a grease stain near his left cuff that no amount of washing had ever fully removed. The parents around him wore tailored suits, silk scarves, pearl earrings, and watches that cost more than his old pickup truck appeared to be worth. They looked at him the way people look at something misplaced. At the front of the room, his 15-year-old son, Miles, stood beside the principal with his head lowered and shame burning across his face. A gold watch had been found in his locker. It belonged to Preston Vale, the son of one of the school's largest donors. Preston said Miles stole it during the winter fundraiser. Two of Preston's friends claimed they saw Miles near the coat room. By the time Nathaniel arrived, the story had already hardened into a verdict. The scholarship boy took something that did not belong to him. A woman in the second row leaned toward another parent and whispered that charity admissions always came with hidden costs. Someone else said it was sad but not surprising. Preston's father, Roland Vale, stood with his arms crossed and stared at Nathaniel as if the only question left was how quickly this poor black father and his son could be removed from the school's polished life. The principal cleared his throat and said Westbridge Academy had standards to protect. Nathaniel looked at his son. Miles would not meet his eyes. Then Roland Vale spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. He said perhaps this was what happened when boys were raised around lack. He said a child could not learn integrity from a man who had nothing to pass down but struggle. A few parents looked uncomfortable. None of them stopped him. Nathaniel stood slowly. He did not shout. He did not defend himself with anger. He reached into the inside pocket of his work jacket and removed a sealed envelope, a thin silver key, and a document bearing the name of the foundation that had funded Westbridge Academy for almost 20 years. The principal went pale before Nathaniel said a word. Because the poor father they had mocked was not a mechanic barely surviving on scholarship aid. He was Nathaniel Elijah Gray, founder of Greystone Global, owner of the anonymous Gray Family Education Trust, and the man whose private endowment had built the very auditorium where they were trying to humiliate his son. But Nathaniel had not hidden his name to trick a school full of rich people. He had hidden it to raise a son who would know the value of character before he ever touched the weight of inheritance. And that morning, everything he had tried to protect was about to break open in front of the one person he loved most. Nathaniel Gray was born far from chandeliers and private school assemblies. He grew up in a narrow house on a street where the sidewalks cracked from tree roots and summer heat rose from the pavement like breath. His mother, Josephine, worked as a seamstress and later as a hotel housekeeper. His father, Elijah, repaired engines in a small garage behind their church. They did not have much money, but their home had order, warmth, and rules that held. Elijah used to tell Nathaniel that a man's name was not protected by money. It was protected by what people could trust him to do when nobody was watching. Nathaniel learned that lesson early. He swept floors in his father's garage. He delivered parts on an old bicycle. He watched his father fix cars for people who could pay next week or next month or sometimes never. Elijah was not soft. He expected work done right, but he never let Nathaniel speak down to anyone who came through the garage doors. A lawyer's car and a janitor's car got the same care because both people needed to get home. When Nathaniel was 17, a shipping error nearly closed a local clinic after medical supplies were delayed for days. His mother's best friend worked there, and Nathaniel watched nurses ration gloves and call pharmacies in panic. He became fascinated by movement, how medicine, food, tools, and machines reached the places that needed them. Years later, after scholarships, night jobs, and more failures than anyone later cared to remember, he built Greystone Global, a logistics and infrastructure company that specialized in moving critical supplies through complicated systems. By 40, Nathaniel was wealthy beyond anything his parents could have imagined. By 42, he was married to Elise. Elise Monroe was a pediatric surgeon with calm hands, bright eyes, and a laugh that made Nathaniel feel less like a man carrying an empire and more like a boy allowed to rest. She had grown up with money, but she never worshipped it. She could walk through a gala in diamonds and then spend the next morning sitting on the floor with a child who was afraid of stitches. She believed privilege was not a sin, but raising a child who felt entitled to it was. When their son Miles was born, Nathaniel saw his whole future rearrange itself around a tiny, breathing body wrapped in a blue blanket. Elise watched him hold the baby and smiled because Nathaniel looked terrified in a way boardrooms had never managed to make him. For the first years of Miles's life, the Grays lived inside guarded gates, private flights, careful calendars, and a kind of luxury so complete it could make reality feel optional. Miles had nannies, tutors, security, drivers, and toys delivered faster than he could want them. At 3, he learned that broken things could be replaced before learning they could sometimes be repaired. At 4, he cried because a birthday cake was the wrong shade of blue, and a staff member apologized as if a crime had occurred. Elise noticed first. One evening, after Miles snapped at a housekeeper for moving his train set, Elise took Nathaniel into the library and closed the door. She said, "Love could become poison if it removed consequence from a child's life." Nathaniel defended himself at first. He said Miles was little. He said they were trying to give him what they had never had. Elise said giving a child everything was not the same as raising him. Then she said the sentence Nathaniel never forgot. "If we give him the world before we give him a conscience, we will lose him to the very life we built." They changed things after that. Smaller gifts, more chores, less staff around Miles, meals at ordinary tables, visits to community clinics and repair shops. Nathaniel took Miles to his grandfather's old garage, which he had kept exactly as Elijah left it. He showed him how to hold a wrench, how to sweep properly, how to say thank you to people who fixed problems with their hands. For a while, it worked. Then Elise got sick. Cancer entered their house quietly, then took over every room. There were treatments, hopes, relapses, private tears, and nights when Nathaniel sat beside her hospital bed counting her breaths because sleep felt like betrayal. Miles was 9 when his mother died. He wore a black suit too stiff at the shoulders and stood between relatives who kept saying his mother was in a better place. Nathaniel wanted to tell them better places should not require leaving a child behind, but he stayed silent. In her final weeks, Elise had written letters, one for Miles at 13, one at 16, one at 18, one for the day he became a father, if that day ever came. She also wrote one for Nathaniel. In that letter, she asked him not to let grief raise their son. She told him Miles would be surrounded by people who wanted access to the Gray name. Some would flatter him, some would fear him, some would treat him as a prince before he had earned the discipline of a decent man. She asked Nathaniel to give their son a life where kindness mattered more than status, where work was not something other people did off stage, where he could be corrected without a lawyer entering the room. Nathaniel read the letter alone in the garage after the funeral. His hands shook so badly he had to set the paper on the workbench. 3 months later, he made a decision that confused everyone who knew him. He stepped back from public leadership at Greystone Global. He placed his voting power in a protected trust. He let a professional executive team manage daily operations. He stopped appearing in magazines. He moved out of the estate and into a modest brick house under Elise's family name Monroe in a working neighborhood near the old garage. He enrolled Miles in public school for 2 years, then later in Westbridge Academy under a scholarship program funded anonymously by the Gray Family Education Trust. To the world, Nathaniel Gray became a private billionaire who had retreated after his wife's death. To Westbridge Academy, he became Nate Monroe, a widowed black father who owned a small repair shop and somehow had a bright son admitted on scholarship. Miles did not know the full truth. He knew his father had once worked in logistics. He knew there was money somewhere enough that they were never hungry, never unsafe, never truly trapped. But Nathaniel told him their life was built on limits for a reason. The big house was gone, the private cars were gone, the staff were gone. If something broke, they fixed it. If Miles wanted new sneakers beyond what he needed, he saved. If he used unkind words with someone, he apologized, face to face. Nathaniel did not make him suffer. He made him participate. On Saturdays, Miles worked at the garage. At first, he hated it. He hated the smell of oil, the scrape of brooms, the way customers sometimes assumed he was just the helper. Nathaniel taught him how to check tire pressure, clean tools, write receipts, and listen when older people talked too long because sometimes the repair they needed was not only under the hood. He also took Miles to the food distribution center Greystone quietly funded, though Miles believed it was a church program. They packed boxes, carried rice, loaded vans, and delivered groceries to seniors. Nathaniel wanted his son to understand that need did not make people less dignified. It made the rest of the world responsible. But childhood does not become simple because a parent has a philosophy. At Westbridge, Miles entered a world that smelled like privilege. The campus had stone buildings, heated walkways, a robotics lab with glass walls, and athletic fields smoother than parks. Students wore expensive shoes and spoke casually about ski trips, lake houses, and summer programs that cost more than many families earned in a year. Some were kind, some were not. Most had never been asked to notice the difference. At first, Miles kept his head down. He was smart, careful, and quiet. Teachers liked him. A math coach called him one of the best students in the grade. A history teacher admired the way he asked questions. But among students, he was marked by scholarship. At Westbridge, money did not have to announce itself because everyone could sense its absence. Preston Vale sensed it immediately. Preston was handsome, confident, and lazy in the way boys become when adults keep clearing the road ahead of them. His father, Roland Vale, ran Vale Capital and donated heavily to the school. Preston treated teachers politely when watched and cruelly when not. He called Miles Garage Boy after seeing Nathaniel pick him up in the old truck. He asked if scholarship students had to return their blazers at graduation. He once dropped his car keys near Miles's feet and told him not to get too excited around something expensive. Miles tried to ignore it. Ignoring is harder when you are 15 and everyone is watching. There were days he came home angry at nothing. He snapped at Nathaniel for driving the truck to school. He asked why they could not live somewhere normal, by which he meant somewhere rich enough that no one asked questions. He said other fathers wore suits, served on boards, sponsored buildings, and did not smell like motor oil at parent meetings. Nathaniel listened the first time. The second time, he made Miles change into work clothes and clean the garage bathroom. Miles was furious. He said his father did not understand what it felt like to be looked down on. Nathaniel stopped at that. For a moment, the garage became very quiet. Then Nathaniel said he understood more than Miles knew, but understanding humiliation did not give a person permission to pass it downward. If Miles was ashamed of work, then work was exactly where they would begin again. The lesson landed badly at first. Most necessary lessons do. Miles began drifting toward Preston's circle anyway. Not fully, not openly, but enough. He laughed at jokes he should not have laughed at. He stopped sitting with a scholarship student named Daniel, whose mother cleaned houses. He lied once and said his father was in private operations because saying repair shop felt too small. He borrowed an expensive jacket from a classmate and told Nathaniel it was from a lost and found sale. Nathaniel saw the changes and felt Elisa's warning rise from the past. If we give in the world before we give him a conscience, we will lose him. The hard part was that Nathaniel had not given Miles the world, he had hidden it. Still, the world had found his son through shame. The winter fundraiser became the turning point. Westbridge held it every December. Donors, parents, alumni, student performances, silent auction, tables, scholarship speeches, and a display of generosity, polished until no one could see the power underneath. Miles had been selected to speak about the scholarship program. He did not want to. Preston made sure of that. For 2 weeks he joked that Miles had been chosen as the grateful poor kid. He told classmates the school loved putting hardship on stage because donors cried easier when the scholarship kids looked nervous. Miles asked Nathaniel if he could skip. Nathaniel said no. Not because he wanted his son displayed, but because refusing to be ashamed was sometimes part of growing. He told Miles to speak truth, not gratitude for crumbs. Scholarships should not make a student bow. They should make a school accountable to talent it might otherwise miss. The night of the fundraiser, Nathaniel arrived late from the garage in the same work jacket. He stood at the back of the auditorium while Miles walked to the podium. Miles's voice shook at first, then he steadied. He spoke about education pressure and how hard it was to belong in a place where people sometimes treated opportunity like charity. Some donors shifted in their seats. Some students looked down. Nathaniel felt proud. Preston felt threatened. After the speech, during the reception, Preston's gold watch disappeared. It was not just expensive, it was sentimental, his father said, though Roland mentioned the price 3 times in the first 5 minutes. Security searched common areas. The next morning, the watch was found in Miles's locker wrapped in a paper towel beneath his gym clothes. Miles said he had never seen it. Preston's friends said otherwise. They claimed Miles had been near the coat room. They said he seemed nervous. They said he had always been weird about rich kids. The story spread before facts could breathe. Nathaniel was called to school. The principal, Dr. Halden, was not a bad man exactly. He was worse in a quieter way. He believed he was fair while fearing donors more than truth. He told Nathaniel the evidence looked serious. He said Westbridge could not ignore theft simply because a student had overcome hardship. He said suspension, police involvement, and scholarship review were all possible. Nathaniel asked whether anyone had checked hallway cameras. Dr. Halden said some cameras in that corridor had been down for maintenance. Nathaniel asked whether anyone had examined Preston's friend's access to Miles's locker area. Dr. Halden said the school did not want to turn the matter into an accusation against other students without cause. Nathaniel looked at him for a long moment. "But you are comfortable accusing mine?" Dr. Halden had no answer. The disciplinary assembly was scheduled under the language of community accountability. In reality, it was theater. Roland Vale wanted public discipline. He wanted the scholarship program reminded of its place. He wanted Preston restored not only his watch, but his superiority. Nathaniel almost revealed everything that morning before leaving the house. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror, holding 2 lives in his hands. Nate Monroe, repair shop father, Nathaniel Gray, billionaire founder, and anonymous benefactor. He wondered whether hiding the truth had protected Miles or left him defenseless in rooms where money spoke first. Then he saw Miles in the hallway, pale and silent, tying his school tie with shaking fingers. Nathaniel helped him. Miles whispered, "Do you believe me?" The question cut deeper than the accusation. Nathaniel held the tie gently and said yes. Not because Miles was his son and therefore automatically innocent, but because he had looked into his son's eyes and seen fear, shame, and confusion, not calculation. Then he said if there was truth, Miles had not told him now was the time. Miles admitted one thing. He had laughed when Preston mocked Daniel 2 weeks earlier. He had not planted the watch, but he had stood near cruelty and chosen belonging. That guilt had made him look scared ever since. Nathaniel placed both hands on his son's shoulders. He said guilt was not always proof of the accusation. Sometimes it was proof that conscience had survived. At the auditorium, everything unfolded as expected. Parents whispered. Preston performed injury. Roland performed outrage. Dr. Halden performed regret. Miles stood at the front like a boy being slowly erased by people who had already decided what kind of child poverty produced. Then Roland said the line about lack. A child could not learn integrity from a man who had nothing to pass down but struggle. That was when Nathaniel stood. He walked down the aisle without hurry. The room watched him the way it had watched him enter, with curiosity, discomfort, and the false authority of people who assumed they knew the size of his life. Nathaniel placed the sealed envelope on the table in front of Dr. Halden. Inside was a letter from the Gray Family Education Trust, authorizing immediate review of Westbridge Academy's scholarship governance, donor influence policies, and disciplinary equity procedures. Attached was a second document identifying Nathaniel Elijah Gray as founder, controlling trustee, and principal funder. Dr. Halden's hands trembled. Roland frowned. What is this supposed to be? Nathaniel removed the silver key next. It was not dramatic to anyone else, but Miles recognized it, the old key from the garage. Nathaniel placed it beside the documents and turned toward the room. My name is Nathaniel Gray, he said. My son knows me as Nate Monroe, because Monroe was his mother's name, and because I wanted him raised close enough to ordinary work that he would never mistake money for worth. For 19 years, my foundation has funded this school's scholarship endowment, its science wing, its transportation grants, and this auditorium. The room went silent in layers. First the faculty, then the parents, then the students. Finally, Miles, whose face changed from shock to hurt so quickly, Nathaniel almost stopped speaking. But the truth had already entered. Nathaniel continued. He said the issue that morning was not whether his son had a powerful father. The issue was whether Westbridge had become a place where poor students were presumed guilty and wealthy students were presumed credible. He said money had already spoken too loudly in the investigation. Now evidence would speak. Then Mara Chen Greystone's legal counsel and an old friend of Nathaniel's entered through the side door with a digital file. Nathaniel had called her the night before, not to reveal himself publicly, but to help verify what he suspected. Greystone's foundation had funded the school's security system years earlier. The main corridor camera had been down, yes, but the maintenance hallway camera near the lockers had not. The footage played on the auditorium screen. It showed Preston and one of his friends entering the locker corridor before school. It showed the friends standing guard. It showed Preston opening Miles's locker with a master access card borrowed from the athletic office, placing something inside and closing the door. It showed him laughing as they walked away. Preston stood up so fast his chair struck the row behind him. Roland shouted that the footage was being misrepresented. Dr. Halden looked as if he might be sick. Students murmured. Teachers stared at the screen with the tired horror of adults realizing they had almost helped punish a child for someone else's lie. Miles did not look victorious. He looked devastated. That mattered to Nathaniel. His son was not enjoying Preston's exposure because he understood, maybe for the first time, that humiliation was not justice by itself. He knew how it felt to stand in front of a room while people decided who you were. Nathaniel asked for the microphone. He said Preston's actions would be handled through proper process. He said Roland's donor status would not protect him. He said Westbridge's scholarship students deserved independent advocacy during disciplinary proceedings. He announced that the Gray Family Education Trust would suspend discretionary gifts until the school adopted new policies, no donor involvement in student discipline outside review for serious accusations, restored cameras anti-bias training with real consequences, and a student dignity council, including scholarship and staff families. Roland called it blackmail. Nathaniel looked at him calmly. No. Blackmail hides the truth. This is what happens when truth is finally allowed in the room. The assembly ended in chaos, but the real storm came afterward. Miles refused to ride home with him. That hurt Nathaniel more than Roland's insult, more than the school's silence, more than the years of watching his son struggle. Miles stood near the steps outside the auditorium and looked at his father, as if seeing both a stranger and a liar. He asked how much of their life had been real. Nathaniel said all of it. Miles shook his head. The house, the truck, the garage, the scholarship, the work shifts, the shoes he had saved for, the lunches he packed while other kids bought whatever they wanted. Was any of that necessary, or had his father turned his childhood into one long lesson? Nathaniel had no easy answer. He said he had wanted Miles to know who he was before the world knew what he had. Miles said maybe he should have been allowed to know both. Then he walked away. With Daniel, the scholarship student he had once abandoned socially and now needed more than pride. For 3 days, father and son lived in the same house like people separated by glass. Nathaniel did not force conversation. He made breakfast, he opened the garage, he answered calls from lawyers, trustees, school officials, and reporters. He declined interviews. The world wanted the clean version of the story. Billionaire father exposes elite school after son is framed. Nathaniel knew the story was not clean. His son had been innocent of theft, guilty of cowardice, wounded by secrecy, and suddenly burdened with a name heavy enough to change every friendship in his life. That was not a headline. That was a childhood cracking open. On the 4th evening, Miles went to the garage. Nathaniel was repairing an old station wagon for Mrs. Alvarez, a retired nurse who had been coming to the shop since Elijah's time. Miles stood in the doorway for a while before speaking. He asked if his mother knew. Nathaniel turned off the work light. He took Miles into the small office behind the garage and opened the metal box he had kept locked for years. Inside were Elise's letters. He gave Miles the one marked 16, though Miles was still a few months away from that birthday. Miles read it sitting in his grandfather's old chair. Elise's handwriting was neat, slightly slanted, and painfully alive. She told Miles that if he was reading the letter, he was old enough to understand that love sometimes makes imperfect choices while trying to protect something precious. She told him his father had more money than any child should have to think about too early. She told him wealth could do beautiful things, but it could also make people confuse access with affection and comfort with goodness. She asked him never to be ashamed of work, never to let anyone make him cruel by making him feel small, and never to judge his father without also asking what grief had cost him. Miles cried before finishing. Nathaniel did not touch him immediately. A boy becoming a man deserves the dignity of not having every tear interrupted. When Miles finally leaned forward, Nathaniel put an arm around him, and for a while the garage held them both without demanding words. Then Nathaniel apologized, not for raising him with chores, not for teaching him limits, not for keeping him near ordinary life. He still believed those choices mattered. He apologized for hiding too much for too long. He apologized for letting Miles walk into rooms unprepared for a truth that belonged partly to him. He apologized for confusing protection with control. Miles asked if they were rich enough to buy anything. Nathaniel said no one was that rich. Miles asked what they could buy. Nathaniel looked around the garage at the tools, the old photographs, the worn desk, the life he had chosen and constructed and defended. He said, they could buy comfort, opportunity, privacy, safety, and influence. They could buy beautiful houses and fast cars and rooms full of people pretending to laugh, but they could not buy a conscience after losing one. They could not buy back years wasted looking down on others. They could not buy trust once they treated it like a game. Miles was quiet. Then he asked what happened next. Nathaniel said that depended on the kind of man Miles wanted to become. The months after the reveal became the real education. Preston was suspended, then eventually withdrawn from Westbridge after the investigation found he had bullied several scholarship students and used donor access to avoid discipline before. Roland Vale resigned from the board after emails showed he had pressured administrators in multiple matters involving his son. Dr. Halden kept his job only after accepting outside oversight and apologizing publicly to the students the system had failed. Some parents complained the school had become political. Others quietly admitted it had been unequal for years. The Gray Family Education Trust changed everything it funded. Scholarships now included legal advocacy counseling, support transportation, and emergency grants for families pressured by school culture. Discipline procedures changed. Donor privileges were limited. Staff children were admitted into summer programs for free. The school janitors, cafeteria workers, and maintenance teams were invited into policy discussions about student behavior because they had seen more truth in hallways than many administrators. Nathaniel insisted that reform reach beyond Miles. A powerful father saving only his own son would have taught the wrong lesson. Miles returned to school, but not as the same boy. At first, students treated him differently, in the worst possible way. Some avoided him because they feared his father. Some tried to befriend him because they wanted proximity to the Gray name. Others whispered that he had been pretending all along. Miles learned quickly that privilege did not end loneliness. It changed its costume. Daniel remained his friend because Daniel had seen Miles ashamed, angry, and wrong before the reveal. Real friendship often begins where performance fails. Miles apologized to Daniel for laughing at Preston's jokes. Not with excuses, not with a speech. He admitted he had wanted to belong so badly that he let someone else be made small. Daniel did not forgive him immediately. He said he appreciated the apology, but being lonely for a few weeks did not equal what scholarship kids dealt with for years. Miles accepted that. Their friendship rebuilt slowly, which made it stronger. Nathaniel made one more decision that surprised everyone. He offered Miles access to the truth of the family's wealth, but not control over it. Miles would learn the structure of Greystone Global, the foundation, the trust, and the responsibilities tied to them. He would attend certain meetings, visit warehouses, study budgets, and hear from workers, but he would not receive open spending power. He would still work at the garage. He would still pack groceries at the distribution center. He would still save for things that were wants, not needs. Miles complained less this time, not because he suddenly loved chores, but because he understood them differently. The garage was not a lie. It was where Nathaniel's values had been formed. The truck was not a fake symbol of poverty. It was the vehicle Nathaniel used to remember roads before private drivers. The modest house was not punishment. It was a place where father and son could hear each other without an estate echoing around them. One afternoon, Nathaniel took Miles to Greystone Global Headquarters for the first time. The building rose in the city's business district, glass and steel catching the sky. Employees moved through the lobby with badges and tablets. A wall display showed routes, shipments, emergency supply chains, clinics served, storms tracked, medicines delivered. Miles stood very still. He had expected luxury. What he saw was responsibility. Nathaniel introduced him not to executives first, but to the overnight routing team. He introduced him to warehouse supervisors, drivers, maintenance staff, data analysts, cafeteria workers, and the woman who managed emergency shipments during hurricanes. He told Miles that every number on a company report had human hands behind it somewhere. If Miles ever inherited influence and forgot those hands, the inheritance would have failed. In the loading bay, an older driver named Mr. Baptiste recognized Nathaniel and laughed. "So this is the boy," he said. Miles straightened, expecting the usual treatment that now came with his father's name. Instead, Mr. Baptiste handed him a clipboard and told him to check crate labels. For 2 hours, Miles worked beside him, sweating through his shirt while medical supply boxes moved into refrigerated trucks. On the ride home, Miles said he had never understood how much work happened after people clicked a button or signed a check. Nathaniel said that was why he needed to see it before he could command any part of it. The final emotional turn came a year later at another Westbridge event. This time, Miles was not being disciplined. He was speaking. The school had created an annual dignity lecture funded by the restructured trust, but led by students. Miles had been asked to give the first address. Nathaniel warned him not to turn it into a performance of humility. Audiences love a redeemed rich boy almost as much as they love a fallen one. Miles smiled and said he knew. He stood on the same stage where he had once been accused. He did not begin with his father's wealth. He began with the watch. He said being falsely accused was painful, but it had also forced him to face the ways he had tried to survive by standing near cruelty. He said Preston was responsible for planting the watch, but he himself was responsible for every moment he had stayed silent while other students were mocked. He said schools often teach leadership as confidence, achievement, and future power, but sometimes leadership is simply refusing to laugh when the room wants permission. Nathaniel sat near the back again this time, in a clean suit, though still not an expensive-looking one. He watched his son speak and felt Elise so strongly beside him that grief became almost gentle. Miles looked toward him once. Then he told the room his father had hidden a name from him, but not a life. The life had been real, the work had been real, the lessons had been real, the hurt had been real too. He said he was still learning that two truths could stand together without canceling each other out. The auditorium listened differently this time, not because Miles was secretly wealthy, because he was no longer hiding from what he had learned. Afterward, a younger scholarship student approached him near the lobby. The boy said he hated getting dropped off in his mother's cleaning uniform car because people noticed. Miles did not give him a motivational speech. He told him he understood shame, and shame was a liar that learned your weakest room first. Then he introduced the boy to Daniel, who was now helping lead the Student Dignity Council. That small moment meant more to Nathaniel than the applause. Years passed. Miles grew taller, steadier, less impressed by rooms designed to impress him. He made mistakes, as all sons do. He sometimes resented the limits still placed on him. He sometimes enjoyed the power of the gray name more than Nathaniel liked. But he also corrected himself faster. He worked summers in parts of Greystone where no one cared who his father was if he missed a shift. He studied ethics and engineering. He spent one gap year working with rural clinics served by the company's logistics network. He learned that becoming a good man was not a graduation. It was maintenance. Nathaniel eventually told him that. They were in the garage replacing brake pads on the old truck Miles had once hated. Miles was 17, almost 18, with Elise's eyes and Nathaniel's quiet when concentrating. He asked his father how he would know if he was ready for the inheritance. Nathaniel laughed softly. He said readiness was not a door a person walked through once. It was more like keeping an engine tuned. Neglect it long enough and even the strongest machine failed. Character needed maintenance, apology work, honest friends, limits memory service, and people around you who could tell you no without losing their place in your life. Miles thought about that, then asked if Nathaniel regretted hiding his identity. Nathaniel took time before answering. He said he regretted the pain caused by waiting too long. He regretted the loneliness Miles carried when he could have been trusted with more truth. But he did not regret giving him a life where work had weight, where people without money had names, where comfort was not automatic, where he could learn dignity before power. Miles accepted that answer, not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. On Miles's 18th birthday, Nathaniel gave him Elise's final letter and the silver key from the auditorium. Not the key to a vault, the key to the old archive cabinet in the garage where family documents, letters, photographs, and company beginnings were stored. Miles expected bank papers. Instead, he found his grandfather's repair receipts, his grandmother's sewing notes, Elise's medical school badge, photos of Nathaniel sleeping in the first gray stone warehouse, and the first route map that became the company's foundation. At the bottom was a letter from Nathaniel. It said the gray name came with companies, trusts, property, and influence, but none of those things were the inheritance. The inheritance was the obligation to remain human while holding power. If Miles ever forgot that, the money would become heavier than poverty had ever been. Miles folded the letter carefully. Then he went inside and helped set the table for dinner. That was the kind of ending Nathaniel had hoped for. Not a son dazzled by wealth, not a son untouched by it either. A son who knew the table had to be set even in a house where someone else could be paid to do it. People outside the family kept telling the story as a dramatic reveal. They said a poor black father was mocked at an elite school. Then everyone learned he was a billionaire. They said the boy accused of stealing turned out to be the heir to the foundation. They said the donors got what they deserved. And yes, that part was satisfying. But the deeper story was not about a rich man humiliating richer fools. It was about a father terrified that money would raise his son worse than hardship ever could. It was about a mother who saw the danger before death took her voice. It was about a boy learning that shame can make you cruel if you do not face it. It was about the painful truth that even love can make mistakes when it tries to protect too much. Nathaniel hid his identity because he wanted Miles to become a person before becoming an heir. He wanted him to know how floors got swept, engines got fixed, groceries got packed, shipments got loaded, apologies got made, and dignity got defended when no camera cared. He wanted him to understand that wealth could open doors, but it could not tell him who deserved to enter. He wanted him to see that every powerful room is dangerous if you forget the people standing outside it. In the end, the hidden name did not make Miles a good man. The reveal did not make him one either. What shaped him were the years before the reveal and the choices after it. The mornings in the garage, the sting of being mocked, the shame of wanting to belong to the wrong people, the courage to apologize, the pain of learning his father had hidden the truth, the grace to understand why, the responsibility of knowing that one day a company, a foundation, and thousands of lives might depend not on his last name, but on his character. And Nathaniel, watching his son grow into that weight, finally understood something Elise had trusted before he did. You cannot protect a child from every wound. You can only give him enough truth, enough love, and enough discipline that the wound does not become his master. So when Miles Gray eventually walked into rooms where people recognized his name before his face, he carried a memory most heirs never receive. He remembered a faded work jacket in the last row. He remembered his father standing calmly while powerful people laughed. He remembered the sound of a school going silent when truth entered the room. He remembered the garage key, the food boxes, the old truck, Daniel's forgiveness, his mother's letter, and the lesson that had taken years to understand. A man is not raised by comfort alone. He is raised by what he is taught to notice, what he is required to repair, and who he becomes when he finally learns what power can do. Nathaniel Gray hid his billion-dollar name from his son for as long as he dared. Not because he was ashamed of it, because he wanted Miles to inherit something stronger first.
Some symbols are worth more than a paycheck. Then let us see what they are worth.
There has been a change in the program. The real keynote speaker is already in the auditorium. Mr. Pierce, if you would join us.
Yes, ma'am.
There has been a misunderstanding.
Collaboration requires consent.
My wife kept my notebooks when I no longer believed they mattered. Truth left unattended does not die. A fragile system survives when pressure is finally understood. Observe, and you will see the boundary method in action.
That is his work.
It always was.
Scholarship is complex. So is theft when it has learned polite vocabulary.
Intelligence is not rare. Access is. This room is not charity. It is overdue.
Is Danforth for people like me? It becomes yours when you refuse to let the door keep its old shape.
Truth left unattended does not die. It waits for someone to stop mistaking the cleaner for the absence of genius.
The first time the auditorium saw Solomon Pierce that morning, he was pushing a mop bucket along the side aisle while 200 professors, donors, and graduate students waited for the most important lecture Danforth Institute had hosted in 20 years. Someone near the front laughed. Someone else whispered that facilities should have finished before guests arrived. A young researcher in a blue suit leaned toward his friend and said the janitor had probably wandered into the wrong room. Solomon heard all of it. He was 64 years old, tall, quiet, and black, with silver in his beard and careful hands that looked more suited to tools than chalk. He wore a gray custodial shirt with Pierce stitched over the pocket. On most days, that shirt made him invisible. On that day, it made him look like an interruption. At the podium, Professor Callum Mercer stood ready to present a breakthrough that could make his career. The screen behind him showed a title about nonlinear systems, boundary stability, and a theorem nobody in the room expected a janitor to understand. Mercer smiled with the confidence of a man who believed the room belonged to him. Then the institute director stepped to the microphone and said there had been a change in the program. The real keynote speaker was already in the auditorium. Solomon stopped beside the first row. For one long second, no one moved. Then the director turned toward him and said, "Mr. Pierce, if you would join us on stage." The laughter died so completely that people could hear the wheels of the mop bucket settle against the carpet. Solomon removed his work gloves, folded them once, placed them on the handle of the bucket, and walked toward the podium. Professor Mercer's face lost its color. Because the man everyone had mistaken for a cleaner passing through was the man whose notebook's equations and forgotten proof had built the lecture they had come to applaud. The janitor they mocked was not there to wipe the floor. He was there to take back his own work. Solomon Pierce had been cleaning Danforth Institute for 11 years by then, but his history with the place began long before anyone handed him a ring of keys. In 1978, he arrived on that same campus with 2 shirts, 1 suitcase, and a mathematics scholarship that his high school principal had described as a miracle. Solomon did not like that word. Miracles sounded as if work had not been involved. He had grown up in West Baltimore, the son of a bus mechanic and a cafeteria worker. Numbers made sense to him before people did. By 10, he could calculate bus routes in his head. By 12, he was repairing radios from discarded parts. By 17, he was solving problems his teachers had to mail to a professor at Morgan State because no one in his school knew how to grade them. Danforth Institute wanted him because brilliance is difficult to ignore when it arrives on paper. But once he arrived, they did not know what to do with him. He was one of only 3 black students in the advanced mathematics program. Professors praised his exams but forgot his name in hallways. Classmates borrowed his notes but did not invite him to study groups. When he solved a problem too quickly, someone asked who had shown him the trick. When he stayed silent, they called him sullen. When he spoke clearly, they called him arrogant. Solomon learned to let the work answer. For 2 years, the work did. He became obsessed with a stability problem that had frustrated researchers for decades. The problem was abstract enough to look useless to outsiders, but Solomon saw it differently. To him, mathematics was not a locked tower. It was a language for describing how fragile systems survive pressure. Bridges, storms, power grids, medical devices, neighborhoods, families. Everything had a boundary where pressure either settled or broke. Then life broke his boundary. His mother had a stroke. His father's hours were cut. The scholarship covered tuition, not the cost of being the oldest son in a family one emergency from collapse. Solomon took night shifts, missed seminars, and traveled home on weekends until exhaustion began eating holes in his days. One professor told him talent without discipline was a tragedy. Solomon did not tell him discipline was waking at 4, catching a bus, bathing your mother, returning to campus, and still solving equations before midnight. Near the end of his third year, Solomon submitted a draft paper to his advisor. It contained the early form of what later became known as the Pierce boundary method, though no one called it that then. The advisor said it was promising but incomplete. A week later, a similar argument appeared in a private faculty memo under a different name. Solomon complained. The complaint went nowhere. The memo disappeared. His advisor warned him not to damage his future with accusations he could not prove. Solomon left Danforth before the semester ended. The official story was academic withdrawal. The private story was grief, theft, exhaustion, and a young black man learning that being right does not always matter when the room has already decided who is allowed to be brilliant. He did not stop doing mathematics. That was the part no one understood. He worked as a machinist, then a night security guard, then a maintenance supervisor at a hospital. He married a nurse named Rosa, who found his notebooks stacked beside Bill's and asked why a man who wrote like that introduced himself as someone who used to study math. Rosa had a way of looking at him that made excuses feel undressed. She told him that if the world refused to give him a room, he could still keep the lamp on. So he did. For decades, Solomon wrote in notebooks after work. Equations filled the margins of grocery receipts, church bulletins, and instruction manuals. He followed journals at public libraries. He mailed occasional corrections to authors who rarely replied. He tutored neighborhood kids for free because talent trapped without guidance felt too familiar to ignore. When Rosa died from cancer, the lamp nearly went out. Danforth re-entered his life through a practical doorway. He needed work, with health insurance, steady hours, and access to a city bus line. The institute needed custodial staff. He applied under his full name, Solomon Lewis Pierce. Human resources never connected him to the old student files stored in archives. Why would they? To them, he was a widower with maintenance experience. On his first night back, Solomon stood alone in the mathematics building and stared at a hallway he had once crossed carrying proofs. Then he picked up the mop and began. Most people treated him politely enough to forget him. That kind of politeness can still erase a person. They said good evening without slowing down. They stepped around his caution signs. They left coffee cups beside trash cans instead of inside them. They spoke freely in front of him because a custodial uniform seemed to promise silence. The mockery came from a smaller group, but it cut deeper. Graduate students in Mercer's lab began calling him Professor Mop after finding and looking at equations left on a board. One of them asked if he was trying to solve the cleaning schedule. Another told him not to erase anything important because some symbols were worth more than his paycheck. Solomon answered with quiet dignity, but the words found old scars. Professor Callum Mercer was worse because he knew how to make disrespect sound like order. He was young for a full professor, ambitious, charming with donors, and cruel when no one powerful was nearby. He once found Solomon copying a line from a chalkboard before cleaning the room. Mercer asked whether custodial staff were now auditing graduate seminars. Solomon said the board had been marked for cleaning, and he wanted to preserve the work before erasing it. Mercer looked at the paper in Solomon's hand and smiled. You preserve the floor, Mr. Pierce. We'll preserve the mathematics. The students laughed because Mercer did. Solomon folded the paper and placed it in his pocket. He had spent too many years surviving condescension to mistake laughter for truth. Still, he helped when he could, quietly. A first-year student named Daniel Ortiz struggled with proofs and often stayed late near tears. Solomon began leaving small hints on sticky notes, never full solutions, just enough direction to help Daniel find the path himself. A doctoral student named Maya Sen noticed that errors vanished from her drafts after nights when Solomon cleaned the seminar room. She began leaving her board covered and a note asking if the room could be cleaned last. Solomon never signed his corrections. He did not want attention. He wanted the mathematics to breathe. Maya was the first to suspect. One night she returned for a forgotten laptop and found Solomon standing at the board, not cleaning it, but rewriting a broken argument with the ease of someone repairing a familiar machine. He stepped back when he saw her. She did not laugh. She only stared. She asked where he had learned that method. Solomon wiped chalk from his fingers and said, "A long time ago." Maya did not push then. But after that, she began bringing him questions. At first, he resisted. Then he saw in her the kind of hunger that deserved not to be starved by pride. Their conversations happened in fragments: a hallway, a storage closet, an empty classroom at midnight. He never spoke like a man showing off. He spoke like someone returning tools to their proper place. Maya told Daniel. Daniel told no one because he owed Solomon too much to turn him into gossip. The trouble began with Mercer's breakthrough. For months, Mercer's lab had been failing to solve a boundary stability problem tied to a major grant. Donors were waiting. A conference deadline approached. Mercer's reputation depended on progress. He became sharper, meaner, less careful. One evening, after a long seminar, Mercer left a flawed proof on the board. Solomon entered after midnight, saw the error, and froze. The structure was close to the old problem he had studied in 1978. Too close. He saw immediately where it failed and where it could be repaired. Without thinking, he wrote 3 lines in the corner of the board, then added a small diagram from a method he had developed in his notebooks decades earlier. He intended to erase it before leaving. A fire alarm test interrupted him. He was called to another building. By morning, the board was photographed, copied, and circulating through Mercer's lab. The 3 lines changed everything. Mercer recognized their value before he understood their origin. He asked the lab who had added them. No one admitted it. A student joked that maybe Professor Mop had done it. The room laughed. Mercer did not. He began searching. Security footage showed Solomon entering the room after midnight. Mercer confronted him in the hallway. His voice was low, almost pleasant. He asked whether Solomon had been writing on research boards. Solomon said he had made a note he should have erased. Mercer asked where the method came from. Solomon said from old work of his own. Mercer stared at him for a moment, then smiled. That smile told Solomon exactly what would happen next. Mercer said memory could be unreliable at Solomon's age. He said advanced mathematics often looked familiar to people outside the field. He said it would be unfortunate if a staff member created confusion around faculty research. Then he told Solomon to stay away from seminar boards unless cleaning them. Within a week, Mercer's keynote title changed. The new abstract included language that echoed Solomon's diagramma's method, even phrases from the old draft he had once submitted to Danforth. Solomon knew because he still had a copy. Rosa had kept it in a blue folder labeled Saul's Light, refusing to let him throw it away during one of his darker years. For the first time in a long time, Solomon felt young and powerless again. Maya refused to let the pattern repeat. She asked Solomon for the old notebooks. He said no. She asked again, not as a student hungry for scandal, but as a mathematician who understood theft when she saw it. Daniel joined her. Nora Bell, the Institute archivist, became involved after Maya searched Solomon's student records and found references to a withdrawn paper from 1981. The archive held more than Solomon expected. There was his admission file, faculty comments, a seminar registration, a letter from Rosa years later asking whether Solomon's old work had ever been acknowledged. And tucked inside a misfiled folder was a carbon copy of the draft he had submitted to his advisor, complete with the same boundary construction Mercer was preparing to present. The timestamp was older than Mercer himself had been when Solomon wrote it. Nora Bell was not dramatic. Archivists rarely need drama. The documents do enough. She contacted the Institute director, Dr. Helena Cross. Helena had built her career on institutional accountability and had little patience for reputations built on borrowed silence. At first, she was cautious. Then she read the draft, compared Mercer's abstract, reviewed the board photograph, and sat very still. She asked Solomon why he had never come forward. Solomon told her the truth. He had tried once. The door had closed. Life had moved. His wife had died. Work needed doing. And after enough years, a man can mistake survival for peace. Helena said peace built on erasure was not peace. The symposium was 3 days away. Mercer did not know the full investigation had begun. He sensed danger, but arrogance made him misread it. He tried to pressure Maya, warning her that young scholars should be careful whose stories they attached themselves to. He told Daniel that loyalty to a janitor would not help a dissertation. He sent an email to facilities complaining that Solomon had become disruptive around research spaces. That email became part of the file. On the morning of the symposium, Solomon arrived early as always. He unlocked storage, checked restrooms, wiped the glass doors, and placed caution signs near a spill by the east entrance. He had been told to attend the lecture, but had not been told exactly how the reveal would happen. Helena asked if he wanted Mercer exposed before the audience. Solomon said he did not want spectacle. He wanted the record corrected. Helena answered that sometimes the record had to be corrected where the lie expected applause. So Solomon pushed the mop bucket into the auditorium. People laughed. Then the program changed. When Solomon reached the stage, Helena did not call him doctor. Not yet. That mattered. His dignity did not depend on a title awarded late by an institution that had failed him early. She called him Solomon Lewis Pierce, mathematician, former Danforth scholar, author of the original Pierce boundary method, and the keynote speaker whose work had shaped the morning's lecture. The screen behind her changed. Mercer's title disappeared. In its place appeared a scanned page from Solomon's 1981 draft, written in his younger hand. Then came the board photograph, then Mercer's abstract, then the archive record confirming submission. The evidence did not shout. It stood there calmly and let the room understand. Mercer rose from his chair. He said there had been a misunderstanding. He said scholarship was collaborative. He said the history was complex. Helena stopped him with one sentence. She said collaboration required consent, and complexity did not erase authorship. The audience watched a man who had enjoyed humiliating others discover the discipline of public facts. Solomon stood at the podium for several seconds before speaking. His hands rested lightly on either side of the wood. He looked at the front row, then the back, then toward the side aisle where his mop bucket still stood. He did not begin with anger. He began with Rosa. He said his wife had kept his notebooks when he no longer believed they mattered. She had told him that truth left unattended did not die. It waited for someone brave enough to dust it off. A few people smiled gently at that. Solomon did not smile. He said Danforth had taught him mathematics, but it had also taught him what institutions can do to people they consider replaceable. Then he turned to the theorem. For 20 minutes, the room forgot his uniform. He explained the boundary method with clarity so clean, it made the difficult seem almost inevitable. He moved through the old proof, the flaw that had stopped earlier researchers, the repair that had come to him while working hospital nights, the diagram Mercer had tried to absorb without its history. He did not perform brilliance. He practiced it. Slowly, precisely, like a man who had carried a language alone for decades and was finally allowed to speak it in daylight. Professors leaned forward. Students stopped blinking. Donors who had expected a ceremony witnessed something rarer, a mind restored to its own work. When Solomon finished the proof, the applause began from the back. Not the front, not the senior faculty, the back. Maya stood first, Daniel beside her, then Nora Bell, then several custodial workers who had been invited quietly by Helena and had watched the whole thing with tears in their eyes. The applause moved forward, slowly gathering force until the auditorium rose. Solomon lowered his head. He had imagined recognition before. In younger years, he had imagined it with hunger, later with bitterness, eventually not at all. Standing there, he realized recognition did not give back the years. It did not return his mother's health, his scholarship, Rosa's life, or the version of himself that might have become a professor if the door had stayed open. Applause could not pay that debt, but it could mark the truth, And truth, even late, was not nothing. The consequences came quickly. Mercer was removed from the symposium program and placed under formal investigation. His grant submissions were reviewed, his students were reassigned. He issued a statement about regret and attribution, but the statement sounded like a man apologizing to language rather than to Solomon. Helena rejected it and required a direct public correction. Mercer eventually resigned before the disciplinary process ended. Solomon did not ask for his ruin. He asked that no student under him be punished for his arrogance. Maya and Daniel received protection and continued their work with new advisors. The Institute opened an independent review of historical discrimination in its graduate programs. Solomon's old advisor was long dead, but the files he left behind revealed other patterns, other names, other students whose work had been dismissed, redirected, or quietly buried. Danforth had thought it was correcting one record. Instead, it found an archive full of closed doors. Helena offered Solomon an office, an honorary doctorate, and a visiting scholar appointment. Solomon accepted the office, only after asking whether custodial staff could use the same faculty library access he had once been denied. Helena said yes. He accepted the honorary degree only after asking that the ceremony include Rosa's name. Helena said yes. He accepted the visiting appointment only after insisting that his first seminar be open to staff, local students, and anyone in the city who wanted to learn without proving they belonged. That seminar filled beyond capacity. The title was simple: Mathematics After Work. Custodians came in uniform. Cafeteria workers came after shifts. Undergraduates sat beside retirees. High school students arrived with notebooks. Solomon taught them not as charity, but as equals meeting a difficult thing together. He began with the same sentence each week: intelligence is not rare, access is. The Institute changed unevenly, as institutions do. Some faculty embraced the reforms. Others grumbled privately that symbolism had overtaken standards. Helena answered that standards had never been the problem. Gatekeeping had. A new program allowed staff and their families to take courses tuition-free. Custodial break rooms were renovated, but Solomon warned them not to confuse paint with respect. Respect meant wages, schedules, health care, voice, and the end of treating workers as background scenery in a place devoted to knowledge. The custodial department changed too. Not because every professor suddenly became kind, but because workers had seen one of their own walk to a podium and make the room listen. People carried themselves differently after that. Not arrogantly, more visibly. A man named Luis, who had cleaned the chemistry building for 16 years, enrolled in night classes. A cafeteria worker named Sharon joined the first open seminar and discovered she loved statistics. Daniel began tutoring the children of staff on Saturdays. Maya built her dissertation partly on extending Solomon's method and made sure his name appeared where it belonged. Solomon kept cleaning for several months after the reveal. People found that strange. Reporters asked why. Donors asked why. Students asked too, though more carefully. Solomon said he had given the job honest years, and leaving it too quickly would make it seem shameful now that people knew he could do something else. He wanted the campus to sit with the truth that the man cleaning the hallway and the man proving the theorem had been the same person all along. On his final night as a janitor, he cleaned the old seminar room where Mercer had first mocked him. Maya and Daniel came by with coffee. They found him wiping the board slowly. For once the board was empty. Maya asked if he was sad. Solomon thought about it. He said he was not sad to leave the work. He was sad for the younger man who had once believed the room could not hear him. Daniel asked what he would tell that younger man if he could. Solomon looked at the clean board. He said he would tell him to keep a copy. They laughed, but softly, because the joke carried too much truth to be light. A year later, Danforth held a ceremony to rename the mathematics lecture hall. Not after a donor, not after Mercer. After Solomon and Rosa Pierce. The Pierce Hall for Open Mathematics. Rosa's photograph stood near the entrance, her smile bright and knowing. Solomon touched the frame before the ceremony began and whispered something no microphone caught. This time he wore a dark suit. No one laughed when he walked down the aisle. But the moment that mattered most came after the ceremony, when a young black boy from a public high school approached him with a notebook hugged to his chest. The boy said he liked math, but did not know if places like Danforth were for people like him. Solomon did not give him a polished answer. He had no interest in telling children that hard work alone melted locked doors. He had lived too much truth for that. Instead, he said, places like Danforth became for people like him when people like him entered, stayed, questioned, learned, and refused to let the door keep its old shape. Then he opened the boy's notebook and asked what problem he was working on. That was Solomon's real victory. Not Mercer's resignation, not the applause, not the honorary doctorate or the building name. Those things mattered, but they were not the center. The center was a boy seeing a future where the man at the chalkboard could look like him, and where the man holding the mop could still hold a mind no institution had the right to underestimate. People continued telling the story for years. They loved the dramatic version. A black janitor mocked by arrogant scholars, a stolen theorem, a public reveal, the janitor walking onto the stage as the true keynote speaker. It made for a satisfying tale because arrogance met consequence in front of witnesses. But the deeper lesson was not that the janitor was secretly brilliant. That framing still made brilliance the surprise. The deeper lesson was that nobody had bothered to wonder what else he might be. They saw a uniform and treated it like a limit. They saw a mop and assumed it erased the possibility of mathematics. They saw an older black man cleaning their rooms and believed his silence proved he had nothing to say. Solomon had always been brilliant. He had been brilliant while taking buses home to care for his mother. Brilliant while working hospital nights. Brilliant while Rosa slept and he filled notebooks at the kitchen table. Brilliant while pushing a mop past students who used his labor and mocked his presence. The stage did not make him worthy. The stage only forced the room to catch up. That is how prejudice often works. It does not always announce hatred. Sometimes it simply narrows imagination. It decides who can be a scholar, who can be a servant, who can ask questions, who can own an idea, who must prove 10 times what others are allowed to assume. It puts people in categories and then calls the categories natural. Solomon's life broke the category. At the end of his first full year as a visiting scholar, he returned alone to the auditorium where everything had changed. The room was empty. Afternoon light fell across the seats. The podium stood at the front, polished and quiet. Solomon walked to the side aisle and stood where his mop bucket had once rested. For a moment, he could almost hear the laughter again. Then he heard the applause. The neither. Only silence remained. And this time, it did not feel like erasure. It felt like space. He took a piece of chalk from his pocket, stepped to the board, and wrote one line from Rosa's favorite note to him. Truth left unattended does not die. Below it, he added his own. It waits for someone to stop mistaking the cleaner for the absence of genius. Then Solomon Pierce, former janitor, mathematician, teacher, widower, scholar, and the man Danforth had finally learned to see, placed the chalk down and walked out through the front doors.